Hello everyone, Jeff with the Greenery here. Soil texture is defined by the relative proportion of sand, silt, and clay particles in the soil. Clay with the smallest size particles is said to have a fine texture. Sand with larger soil particles has a coarse texture. Texture refers to the soil's ability to hold water and provide adequate airspace for good root growth. The texture of the soil influences its physical and chemical properties, including amount and availability of nutrients, compaction, drainage, aeration, pH buffering, and root penetration. Ideally, there is a balance between the moisture holding capacity of small particles and the amount of airspace provided by large particles. Clay particles are invisible even with most microscopes. The particles are less than 0.002 millimeters in size. They're shaped somewhat like mica or coins. When compacted, they can stack together tightly. Clay is sticky to touch and has very small pore spaces that don't allow air or root movement. Water is held tightly to the clay particles. Clay soils are more likely to be poorly drained, but to have more nutrients. Clay is chemically active in soil. Clay is used in a wide variety of products, such as bricks, makeup, medicines, and pottery. Silt particles start at clay particle size and move up to 0.05 millimeters. They're smooth like baking flour and have small pore spaces that allow some water, air, and root movement. Water is held, but it's also released to roots. Silt is not chemically active in soil. Sand particles are huge when compared to clay, ranging from silt size up to 2 millimeters. A 2 millimeter sand particle is 1,000 times bigger than the largest 0.002 millimeter clay particle. Sand is gritty to touch and has large pore spaces that allow easy air and water movement. It holds very little water for plants. It drains well, but doesn't hold many nutrients. Sand is not chemically active in soil. Sand grains are round like a beach ball, while silt particles are flat like a plate, and clay particles are flat like a coin. Imagine filling rooms of beach balls, plates, and pennies. There would be a lot of space between the beach balls and about the same volume of space between the plates, but there would be very little empty space in the room full of pennies. At the same time, there is a lot more particle surface area on the pennies than the plates or balls. The types and sizes of soil particles and pore spaces influence soil aeration, drainage, and water holding capacity. If a clay particle and a sand particle were both magnified at the same rate, and the clay particle was enlarged only to the size of a 2 millimeter sand particle, about a 1/16 of an inch, the sand particle would now be over 6.5 feet across, 78 3/4 inches. When dry clay soil contracts, it creates cracks that can break roots. When wet, it expands to fill all voids, preventing water movement through the soil. If soil textures are very different from each other, water may not easily cross the boundary between the two textures. Water has a hard time moving from fine textured soil that has very small pore spaces into coarse textured soil that has large pores. The water will have to build up pressure to overcome the surface tension that holds the water in the small pores. Many people want to add gravel to the bottom of a flower pot or the bottom of a tree planting hole. The gravel supposedly will allow the water to drain. First, unless there's a place for the water to drain to, it will go nowhere in the gravel. More importantly, the water in the fine textured soil above the gravel will build up to a saturation before dripping out into the larger pore spaces. The saturated soil has no air, and so roots drown in the soil above the gravel. The moral of the story is to never add a layer of gravel in the bottom of a pot or planting hole. The famous soil texture triangle can be used to assign a textural class to a soil by estimating the percentage of sand, silt, and clay particles within it. Clay particles tend to dominate many textural classes and most of the area of the triangle. When fixing a soil, a large amount of sand or silt is needed to balance the negative effects of clay. Silt Loam is the name given to an ideal Thrive Range gardening soil for most vegetable plants. It contains about 0 to 25% clay, 20 to 50% sand, and 50 to 80% silt. The loamy soils are looser, hold the most plant available water, drain well, and have a good nutrient holding capacity and contain lots of air. Sand, silt, and clay particles bind together to give a soil a stable structure called an aggregation. The smallest stable unit that maintains its integrity is called a soil bed. The size and shape of beds affects the size of the pores and the ability of the soil to hold water. Most nutrient molecules available to plants are positively charged and called cations. Some have a negative charge and are called anions. Clay and organic matter particles are negatively charged. Positively charged mineral ions, the cations, they adsorb to them, such as calcium, hydrogen, magnesium, potassium, and sodium. These cations stick to the negatively charged soil particles and are at equilibrium with ions dissolved in the water in the soil pores. There are far more cations stuck to the soil than there are in solution. Soil is rated by how well it holds nutrients, and this is called the cation exchange capacity. The higher the better. Nutrients stick to the soil particles by adsorption. Socks sticking to a sweater coming out of the dryer are also sticking by adsorption. Fertile soils hold more nutrients and have more clay and organic matter. Soil textures in the soil texture triangle have different cation exchange capacity levels, depending on the amounts of each ingredient of clay, silt, and sand. Clay has a cation exchange capacity range of 10 to 150. Organic matter's cation exchange capacity ranges from 200 to 400. Silt and sand have very little cation exchange capacity. Organic matter is not listed in the soil triangle because most soils have only 1 to 5%. Much of the organic matter is only in the soil temporarily, and it's continually breaking down into basic chemicals through the actions of bacteria, fungi, and tiny animals. Most soils would benefit from the addition of organic matter. It separates the particles of clay soils to allow more air, and it fills the pore spaces in sandy soils to hold more water. It adds nutrients, and it holds nutrients for slow release. It has a high cation exchange capacity. It improves the structure of soil, and it is the home of and food source for biological organisms. And this is Jeff with the Green Review. Thanks for watching.